I thought it was about time to address some of the very valid criticisms that some of my videos have garnered. Criticism and self-reflection are really important to me, and I hope that this video can act as an extension, an addendum to some of these world-building videos and the ideas contained within. Feel free to skip around to any of the topics I choose to address here, and I hope we can add some more nuance to our world-building discussions. Firstly, one of my recent videos, a discussion of the ethics of necromancy. It fell short of my usual standards. Early on in my process, I dismissed the idea of any financially incentivized donation of a corpse, and largely failed to consider a society where donation of a corpse for necromantic purposes was a positively connoted thing. And that's my bad. There are plenty of cultures around the world who don't see the corpse as an object of disgust or hatred. Rather, they have reverence for the corpse and for their ancestors, even in their physical, decaying forms. A society in fantasy may well exist where those who see the perpetuation of a nation, a realm, or a familial unit as a really important thing may well choose to donate their corpse for the purposes of necromancy with no coercive reward or threat, just simply for the perpetuation or protection of the realm or family unit. The thing is, an army of soldiers or labourers incorporating the bodies of a nation's dead is a really dramatic and thematic story beat. But it must be noted that even in our modern history, this may be more ethically complex than it seems. The problem comes in the future direction of a nation or organisation or familial unit being uncertain. Germany is a very good modern example. A 100-year-old skeletal warrior, for example, may have served a collection of very different regimes over the years, even if it is now used in a defensive standing army for the purpose of protecting the people. While a skeleton donated in Germany 60 years ago would immediately raise some red flags if it were continued to be used in the modern day. So it all really depends on to whom your corpse goes. A feudal lord? The king? Your own family? Who's maintaining it? Is it a local necromancer, or are they a team of necromancers contracted to the state? Or some faith? There is no guarantee with any of these that any given person's corpse won't be used to perpetuate oppression or harm the donator's own community in the future. So as in the original video, term limits on use and a clear registry of prior lives and permissions should need to be made for any ethical necromancy to take place. Even if you give your corpse for the sole reason, the sole permission of mining labour in dangerous mines, there is no guarantee that these mines will be used forever to perpetuate a organisation which you yourself align with ideologically. This mine will well be used to prop up a machine of war, or a foreign state that takes over the land. However, voluntary donation is still a far better solution than my own. I suggested that co-opting the justice system would make sense, to use sentencing and prison terms to set term limits on the undead labour required to pay off crimes. Not only is this a gross simplification of the role of prison systems in education and rehabilitation, I also unknowingly perpetuated the surprisingly very real system of modern prison labour, which still exploits the labour of persons and prisoners today, especially in the modern United States. Forced labour is forced labour, no two ways about it, and linking what I assumed to be a historic practice of at least 60 years hence to an ethical system was still not ideal, notwithstanding its usage in modernity. Criminals do not forfeit their rights to humanity, to fair treatment or equity in any ethical system, and parroting the outdated notion that committing a crime against one's fellow man somehow robs a person of their rights is not the wisest, especially as the fantasy world I proposed incentivizes longer and longer sentences to get more undead labourers for longer. For a small point in my own defence, I will say that every D&D style justice system that I have ever used involves heavy use of Zone of Truth as best it can be used to limit corruption in the system to some extent, but even that is not perfect, as my video on the subject demonstrates. In my video on adventurers guilds, I make the point that no historical organisation has ever existed like an adventurers guild. This is untrue, and I'm annoyed I said it, because the gentlemen's clubs of the wealthy West in the Age of the Empire were certainly quite similar. A collection of elites looking to go to the far reaches of the world and explore for untold riches, to meet strange beasts, and to map the world. I was thinking, in this case, from a medieval perspective, which was before these groups sprang up, but there was a sort of organisation where combatants gathered in specialised units to take jobs in guarding things or in going to war, mercenary companies or free companies. In a world that has a concept such as this, a group of battle-hardened veterans out of work in the army of their local lord who strike out seeking their own fortune and their own contracts, it is likely that these companies would be pretty busy and a cost-effective way to solve many problems. Most historic mercenary companies were bands of soldiers who grouped together, mostly accepting members through vouching and by association. A key feature of the medieval period sees these free companies hired on to fight alongside the armies of countries and states as a specialist unit who is generally more experienced, and in turn these mercenary companies seek to build up their own mythologies as experienced fighters, and eventually tend to seek to claim territory for themselves, as their own ranks form a decently well-trained, permanent standing army. In a world where the enemy is not only other nations, but monsters too, mercenary companies would be in almost perpetual employment. I see it very likely that contracting such a group to clear out a monster would be the quick and dirty approach, probably favoured by military officials and advisors, as they can at least recognise some of the names of the ex-soldiers who swell the ranks of these military companies. After all, they've worked with them before. A country that doesn't pay properly, though, may find this free company declaring an occupied enclave within their territory after the beast is slain, or the nation may be expected to knight the leader. What this potentially means is that a mercenary-style adventurers guild would not grow from a guild seeking further protections for itself and its products, and overtaking the local liege lord's safeguards through throwing their commercial weight around, but by throwing their military prowess around instead. I can certainly see a mercenary-styled adventuring company muscling in on all of the local contracts, establishing a monopoly on skilled, organised violence that rivals the Lord's own, seeking to claim territory for themselves. But I would envision this to necessitate a spirit of brotherhood in arms beyond the traditional adventurers guild, which has a slightly more union vibe. A mercenary-styled company would be far less accommodating than, say, an adventurers guild to incorporating the new band of adventurers in town into their ranks, partly because they don't recognise them from their days as soldiers, and partly because adventurers tend to be independent operators, making them a wonderful counter or starting enemy for a group of player characters, and a brilliant story beat. In TTRPGs at least. In my video on fantasy polytheism, I use Bhaal from D&D's canon as an example. Firstly, I am not here discussing the historical deity Bhaal with 2 A's and no H. I can see where that confusion may stem from. I suggest that the Bhaal in question is a poorly imagined deity, as he's the lord of murder and very little else. This is not actually fair to the Forgotten Realms world building. Firstly, how intensely devoted a small cultic following is affects the deity's power. So even a god who is not worshipped by most people most of the time can have great power if his cultic following is fervent enough. Secondly, I implied that Bhaal was a major god, which is untrue. Lastly, and worst of all, I suggested that ritualized killing and murder was not a common enough cultural practice for a deity of this kind to receive regular worship. This is wrong in a fantasy world. Goblins, orcs, dragons, and all sorts of other monstrous creatures roam the world, often with goals that very much necessitate the murder of people. Add to that the historical precedent for ritualized murder in our own faiths throughout history, from the Druids to the Aztecs to the Egyptians, and I was definitely very wrong to dismiss Bhaal as ritually impotent. Finally, we should talk about elves. I said some pretty nasty things about everyone's favourite beautiful androgynous fantasy folk, but what I really want to discuss is actually the one compliment I gave them. I suggested that a creature that lives for 700 years would be a wonderful historian, record keeper, and might be able to synthesize teaching from throughout its lifelong experience to be a wise and progressive advisor. This is not a fair assessment unless long-lived species have some way to vastly bypass the limits of memory recall that we observe, at least in humans. Essentially, as it's been expressed to me in the comments of that video, we should not be imagining some ancient sage like from the epic tales of human myth, but rather a curmudgeonly, out-of-touch old fart who has nostalgia for growing up in a time they can barely even remember. Progress in history usually does not come from the single-minded genius who is able to develop new thoughts entirely independently of history as some polymath across their entire lifetime. Take Robert Fitzroy as an example. An accomplished sailor, captain, and the first man to predict the weather using meteorological phenomena in the modern sense, at least. His work built on the shoulders of thousands of others, from the natives of conquered, explored, and oppressed lands, who had their own brilliant understandings of local weather currents, systems, and patterns, to cartographers, sailors, and geographers who came before him. Fitzroy was able to synthesize all of this information into a meteorological prediction system that could anticipate weather patterns, and the Victorians laughed at him. His work was, in fact, pretty groundbreaking and is the basis of modern meteorology. But unfortunately, the Victorians didn't see this as a real science. And much more in keeping with the popular opinion of his mind, he was also a staunch critic of Darwin's Origins of the Species. Fitzroy was one of the greatest minds of his generation, an inventor of something truly revolutionary, who could nonetheless not handle the criticism levelled at him for his creation. He believed in meteorology for all of his existence, and was even, ironically perhaps, the captain of Darwin's famous voyage on the Beagle. But as he grew older and more set in his ways, he only had room for one truly anti-majority course, his beloved meteorology. And by the time he was in his 50s, his mind had solidified. So what can we learn from this when it comes to elves, longevity, and the legacy of genius? It is somewhat true that younger people have a greater proclivity for more elastic ways of thinking. As we get older, our thought patterns tend to solidify, and we tend to find it more difficult to challenge our core beliefs, although this is not universally the case. If all of that can happen in just 50 years, for elves this cycle might be really quite dramatic. Perhaps in some cases the first 100 years of an elf's existence are filled with experimentation with what's proper, brief dalliances with the unconventional. If Fitzroy was a long-lived elf, he might have had 100 years of creativity which would have easily encapsulated both his meteorological discoveries and perhaps a appreciation for Darwin's theories. Alternatively, perhaps we assume that Fitzroy as an elf finishes much of his experimental period by the 1860s. Like in real life, perhaps if this is the case, with a foggy memory setting in, he may start to lose those memories of himself and Darwin as younger men, sharing notes on geography. Perhaps tied down to his meteorological office, he insists on maintaining control of this organisation as long as he can, running the place with sea charts and physical maps well into the 20th century. Of course, it's also possible that elves may rather operate in cycles. Perhaps their thinking in new developments solidifies every so often, leaving them behind the times, with them then only forced to re-evaluate their position every 100 years or so when it becomes obvious that times have moved far beyond them. In either case, elves and other long-lived species are unlikely to be mass early adopters of new technological developments, waiting instead to see what bears fruit and what ideas are abandoned and doomed to fall by the wayside. Because frankly, over a 700-year lifespan, you're going to be burned a fair few times if you are always adopting something early. Better to just wait and see, be conservative until it is obvious that you need to learn this new technique. Add into that issues with seriously long-term memory recall, which is not a universal problem in humans and can be trained to avoid, to some extent, in fairness. And we have a set of species who are likely to be stuck a few years in the past. Our elven Fitzroy in the modern day might have been already ousted from his meteorological office for his dated methods, and may well have retired into obscurity, still writing his own charts based on the shipping forecast and sea charts from long ago. He may well have been just overwhelmed by the mass automation of his invented field. Maybe he's changed his mind, along with the rest of the world, on Darwinian evolution by this point, as society has adopted it as a standard assumption, but may have lost some recollection of his personal connection to that research. Perhaps some human reporter finds a way to contact him in the 2020s, jogging his memory and asking some questions about his famed captaincy of the Beagle, giving him a new lease of life as Robert Fitzroy, inventor of the weather report and last living link to Charles Darwin's famous expedition. He might find himself a new career as a science communicator in the United States, some parts of which creationism has a surprisingly healthy hold upon, as a reformed ex-creationist himself, or just like the real human Fitzroy, he may find himself at the tragically young elven age of 60, caught in the throes of depression. That would be his end. Being an elf does not necessarily spare you the torturous gaze of the public eye, or stop your life's work feeling meaningless. After all, we must remember that elves in a fantasy world are, at the end of the day, people, and are subject to many of the same tragic and unfortunate situations that we find ourselves in, whether it be mental or physical disease, anguish, depression, or any such thing. Elves are most likely not immune from those most human of ailments and maladies. But with that said, thank you for watching. I hope this has been a fascinating look at some of the things I've definitely got wrong throughout my videos, and given you new insights on many of these topics that could help spur further creativity. That's always my goal with this sort of video. If you did enjoy, I'll certainly look out for other mistakes that I will inevitably make in the future. So please do keep letting me know what I can touch on then. And if you have enjoyed, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, so I know that you want more. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I have been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.